non-negotiable. It operates out of a whole batch of very carefully worked out instincts. So it's an instinctual brain. And by non-negotiable, it means it's going to operate by its instincts and not by any higher intelligence. We have governments that are non-negotiable. You know, I bite first, and we'll talk about it later. So this ancient instinctual, and it's our defensive brain. It's our brain that carries within it our major survival instincts, all right? We can call it our survival brain. And everything it does centers around survival. Survival of both self and our whole species. The basic sexual brain is this ancient reptilian brain, and so on, and the brain that drives for food, clothing, shelter, etc., etc. Now, when we start looking at the characteristics of the forebrain, I'm going to combine both of them together. Actually, there are three different parts of the forebrain, but in this research it referred to hindbrain, forebrain, so I'm carrying through on that kind of talk. So here we have the forebrain is made up of the emotional brain that was added much, much later to the old reptilian brain. It took nature hundreds of millions of years to develop that hindbrain, a brain of defense, of a sensory system. I think of Max Wellman saying after hundreds of millions of years the universe created this visual process, a way by which the universe could look at itself. Isn't that a great way to put it? And so this great sensory motor brain came in. But it's a very limited brain, and so then nature goes ahead and builds on that another second story, let's say. And this, of course, is making a cartoon of it. Those of you in brain research can hold your side and roll on the floor laughing, but this cartoon works to get the major ideas across. And this is called the limbic brain. It's called the emotional cognitive brain, or the old mammalian brain. This brain didn't appear until mammals came on the earth. And what is it for? It's for our immune system. All learning and memory seem to take place in this brain system right here. All of our likes, dislikes, aversions, attractions, all that kind of thing take place in this brain. It does all sorts of things. Antonio Damasio, one of our brilliant young, well, I don't know if he's young. He was young when I first read him. Damasio talks about that emotional brain is really the key to how the great higher brain can function. And so to think of a thinking brain without the emotional brain is silly. You can't have them. You've got to have both of them together. And then the great thinking brain up on top where all of our creativity and language goes. Language belongs to this latest brain, the neocortex, etc. So we find the forebrain is the source of all of the, what we would think of as that which makes us human: intellect, language. What else did we say? Oh, it's just about everything that makes us anything. It's the forebrain. And that lifts us above the poor old black snake out in the backyard. And so just bear in mind that the emotional state of a mother depends on whether that infant is going to be born with an enlarged forebrain and reduced size hindbrain, or vice versa. Does that make sense? This I found myself very disturbing for a lot of reasons. I want to run through a couple of things that we found since Paul MacLean's work. Back in the 80s, they made a big discovery that there was really a fourth brain in the head. Now, I don't have a good sketch of it, so I made one of my homemade ones. It looks like this, pretty messy. I didn't go to Waldorf, so I'm not much of an artist. But we find actually the brain for thinking here and feeling and action develops in utero, and they really make up the three trimesters in utero. But the fourth brain, which is right behind our forehead, it's called the prefrontal cortex, can't develop in utero. It has to wait until we're born into the world, and then it starts growing very rapidly from the moment of birth on for the first 9 months. Now the trick is that the fourth brain, the prefrontal cortex, is tremendously experience dependent and sensitive. And just as we find the three brains grow in utero according to the mother's emotional state, it's even more critical for the development of the great prefrontal cortex, because the infant must be in an unbroken emotional relationship, a positive emotional relationship with the mother for a properly unfolding prefrontal cortex. Let me tell you, when I get into a lot of this, I kind of get jealous. I've got 5 children, I have 12 grandchildren, 1 great-grandchild, and none of mine fell into the category I'm going to talk about for just a minute. And ever since I've been thinking, why not me, Lord? How did I get left out here? But this prefrontal cortex starts developing right after birth, and it develops according to 2 things: the size and functioning of the threefold brain that developed in the mother's womb, and the ongoing unbroken contact with that mother in what we call the in-arms period. The in-arms period, which is the next 9 months after birth. So there already we have 2 9-month periods. First 9 months inside, next 9 months in arms. And then we get to the 9 months from about the 9th month to the 18th month is the third, what I call the third matrix period. And they're all 3 critically dependent on the infant child's strong emotional support during that entire time. The brain actually grows in response to strong emotional support, or it will be deprived or compromised if there is no strong emotional support. Got the picture? You following enough? Okay. Now, we'll be talking about the prefrontal cortex because that just happens to be one of the most important structures in the whole brain. I'll talk about the prefrontal cortex right now since I've mentioned it. The one that starts its growth right after birth and grows in response to what has happened in uterine period, whether that was a strong emotional period or not, and whether that is continued in the so-called in-arms period. Any separation of mother from infant in the period immediately after birth has a tendency to seriously compromise the prefrontal cortex. And you look at people with a simian slant like mine, no apparent prefrontal cortex, and you can read their history pretty well right there. So if we want to look, I'm going to just describe the difference of it. The forebrain in general is the seat of intellect, language, creativity, and all sorts of things, but most of that, in the last analysis, depends on the prefrontal cortex. All of us have one. Relax. We all have one. Some of us have more than the other. But the prefrontal cortex was really only discovered, and they started real research into it about 1988. Now that's just the other day in neuroscience. And what they have found is the prefrontal cortex is really the governor of the whole brain system, or designed by nature to be the governor of the whole brain. The prefrontal cortex is the one, through its connecting links, that can completely moderate, modulate, and control the behavior of the ancient defensive hindbrain, the brain that drives for sex, food, safety, security, and I'll bite you if you get near it. Got it? That brain. The prefrontal cortex can control and modulate and moderate that completely. That's what it was designed for. And then we have the emotional cognitive brain, where all of our emotions are, our loves, our hates, our violences, our all the rest of the things that we think of in relation to emotions. The prefrontal cortex can control and modulate and moderate that kind of brain activity. And then the thinking brain itself, the thinking verbal brain. You know, we can think ourselves into some awful states and do some awful stupid things with our thinking brain, with our intellect.